Hello. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the peer review process that goes on in scientific journals, particularly those in the field of addiction science. And in some respects, it's like a black box. Most people don't know what goes on within the process of making a decision about a manuscript that is submitted to an addiction journal. And they don't know what goes on inside the editor's head, who has to make the final decisions, often based on feedback from assistant editors and peer reviewers. So today we're going to go through that process to give you a better idea of how those decisions are made and how you can avoid having manuscripts rejected if you're an author on it. One analogy is to The Wizard of Oz. And it was about a little girl who got blown away by a tornado in the Midwest. And she takes a journey to find the Wizard of Oz so she can get back to her family. And when she got to this place where this big wizard was supposed to be present, operating all kinds of pyrotechnics, explosions and noises and bands and everything in a big theater. When they walked in there, they were totally baffled by what was going on. But the little dog Toto walked over behind a curtain in a booth and pulled back the curtain. And there behind the curtain was the Wizard of Oz, who was pulling all these levers, trying to impress people with the mystery of what was going on inside the big theater. In a sense, what you have is this big theater where all kinds of big things are going on, but you don't know who's pulling the levers behind the scenes. And when it comes down to it, that editor-in-chief is like the Wizard of Oz. He or she is just an ordinary person who's doing things, and because they're behind a curtain, people think that they have some sort of extraordinary power. So we're going to take you through how editors think and how they make decisions, and you can judge for yourself whether the Wizard of Oz is just an ordinary person. And that means in part that at the beginning, you are in a position to ask the editor questions like, I'm thinking of submitting an abstract. What do you think about it? And does it have a good fit to your journal? Don't be afraid of approaching an editor with simple questions like that. In most cases, they will respond. The second thing to know is what editors want in terms of manuscripts that are submitted to their journal. They want good quality. So you need to make sure that the paper is well written, but also that it's dealing with an original topic. So originality is the second criterion. They don't want stuff that's been replicated by others numerous times and you're just repeating it in a similar way. They want new studies. They want good methods that are sound, that can't be criticized, especially if they have fatal flaws. Editors want a good fit to their journal. So each journal has a theme, it has a culture, and you want to make sure, after looking at some representative issues for that journal, that your article fits with the types of papers that are published in the journal and with the mission statement. Another thing is that editors want papers that don't cause a lot of trouble. If your paper is not well prepared and it requires a lot of editing, it's in poor English, it's missing methods and things like that, even though the topic is important and the methods are good, the editor may reject it because it's just going to take too much trouble to bring it into compliance with the minimal standards for that journal. A final thing about editors is they want papers that other people are going to read and to cite. It's not just to inflate their impact factors. That, I think, is sometimes taken into account. But editors also want papers that are going to have an impact on the field. And if you can convince the editor in a cover letter and in your introduction and discussion that the topic is important, that other people are going to be reading this article, citing it, and exploring the ramifications and implications, then you may have a good chance of getting your article accepted. Final decisions after an article is submitted, reviewed, tentatively accepted in terms of asking for revisions and finally revised are again the importance and originality of the article, whether or not you've met the reviewer's concerns when you receive the critiques, whether or not it has any fatal flaws. The journal philosophy is important, whether space is available and editorial work is required. Space available is something people don't consider. If you have long articles, editors may be reluctant because in some cases they could publish 2 papers if your paper is very long. And that's why they often impose page limits or word limits on their article. But another thing that authors don't realize is that when reviewers come back with reviews that are praising the authors, saying this is a good paper, but having recommendations for minor revisions, in some cases, the editor will not accept it. And that's in part because the editor feels that it's not original enough, or it's not interesting enough, or it doesn't fit the journal's philosophy, but also there's no space available. There are many papers that meet the minimal criteria for publication, but they're not accepted because a journal can only publish so many papers in each issue. So you need to keep that in mind. You got to be a cut above what the average author is submitting. Triage is a mechanism that journal editors use to quickly come to a decision on a manuscript that doesn't meet the minimal criteria. If it has a fatal flaw, if it's just not interesting, if it's too long, if it's too short, missing a lot of things, the editors look at it and say, gee, this isn't going to make it. We might as well cut our losses at this point and inform the authors. What you may receive, as I've done myself in a number of cases, is a form letter from an author with very little feedback, if any, about why they're rejecting it. In the journal that I manage, the Journal of Studies on Alcohol and Drugs, we try to give each author a complete or a relatively complete explanation of why we're not proceeding to peer review. And we triage as many as 50% of the submissions to our journal. So the editor and an assistant editor will look at the manuscript, see if there are any fatal flaws, see if it's interesting enough, and make a decision at that point whether to reject it at that time or to send it on to an assistant editor for management in the peer review process, which generally involves 2 or 3 reviewers. So in order not to be triaged, you really need to have a good quality paper that meets the instructions to authors and is considered by the editor as worth reviewing compared to other papers that are typically published in that journal. Instant rejections, on the other hand, are rejected because they're outside the scope of the journal. that they ignore the instructions to authors. There are big or major methodological weaknesses. They're often purely descriptive or parochial, or there are no hypotheses, no theory tested, and the conclusions are overblown. So these are reasons why your manuscript may come back without being reviewed. And if that happens, you need to pick a journal that is less competitive. And you need to revise your paper to make sure that you are improving the quality to the point that it meets minimal standards. If a paper is sent out for review and it's rejected, it's often for a variety of reasons, including the introduction to the paper just doesn't present an interesting argument or present the concept of the study in a way that's well organized. You need to summarize previous research. You need to make sure that you're covering the literature, in part because you have to be fair in the way that you present your research question, in part for the very practical reason that your paper may be sent to reviewers who are intimately familiar with this particular area of research, and they're going to be looking for you to cite papers that are relevant to your research question. If you miss those papers, the reviewers are not going to have confidence that you know what you're talking about. You need to state the objectives of your study or your article, and you need to state hypotheses to be tested. Ideally, those hypotheses should be derived from the literature in terms of theory, and that is an excellent way to set up your introduction. Finally, don't include your conclusions in the introduction. The methods section is another area where authors lose points. You need to convince your readers and your reviewers that the methods are valid. That means not just saying you used questions to measure this variable or that variable. You need to refer to standardized measurement instruments. You need, if you're using self-report measures, to establish the reliability and the validity of those particular instruments through appropriate citations and published papers. It's very common for authors to neglect the way that the sample was drawn and the generalizability of the sample. If a sample is not representative, or if you have low response rates, it's not necessarily a fatal flaw, but you have to deal with it in the methods section in terms of making the argument that this particular sample may have limitations, or it may be representative even if there was a high attrition rate. If you don't deal with it there, you can be sure that the reviewers are going to pick that up. Results sections. Results are criticized because sometimes you include conclusions in the results section rather than just stating the findings. Results can be criticized because data are not described, or statistical analyses are overly presented as, for example, if you have trends and you start discussing them in terms of the fact that, suggesting that they're significant or substantial effects, or you leave out substantial or important findings. Graphics are a good way of presenting your data, so it makes the article more interesting and interpretable. Data analysis is another problem, particularly dealing with confounding variables. Confounding is often a fatal flaw that is cited in the rejection of a manuscript. So the best way to deal with it is either an experimental design or through statistical controls that correct for confounding. one way or the other, you need to deal with it both in your analyses, in your results section, and in the interpretation of your findings. Also, you need to be careful about citing non-significant associations and differences. Problems with discussions deal with not properly introducing your main findings and exploring their implications. You need to return to the questions posed in the introduction. You can't go off on a tangent. You need to deal with the aims that you've established at the beginning. You need to place the findings in context of previous research. And it needs to be done efficiently. You need to make sure that you consider alternative interpretations. Don't just present your findings in terms of how they confirm your hypothesis. You need to be self-critical as well. And be careful of your language and political implications. Don't imply that this particular study is going to solve all the world's problems. And don't get into jargon and sloganeering about the implications of your findings. Finally, in order to optimize your chances of getting your submission reviewed and getting it accepted, make sure that your article matches the journal's mission. It's of an appropriate quality comparable to other articles published in that journal. Read the instructions in a very detailed way. Provide a good abstract at the beginning, and revise your manuscript thoroughly and quickly so that the editor is satisfied that you've made a good faith effort to respond to the reviewer's concerns. If you do that, your chances of getting your article accepted will be much better.